changing of the aesthetics of the landscape, and it has to do with water, and GSI will get related into it also. But the other thing that I need to qualify this by is depending on whose perspective you're looking from, you know, the timeline's going to have different information on it. So of course, I'm looking from a Tucson Basin centric perspective, but also I will say that I'm looking at this from a designer and a landscape architect perspective. So when the GSI timeline was done, it was really more from maybe stormwater management perspective and how all of that evolved. So you're going to see more about landscape than GSI, this one. So this is this short timeline of how the culture of water and landscape has been changing. And just here regionally, as well as probably statewide. In Tucson water, this is the graphic that we're now showing in terms of how we are using water individually. So 80 gallons per person per day is the average use. And all of this sort of shows how that water is being used in the various outlets. But for us here, what we're interested in is that outdoor use. And so this is sort of where my perspective is from the landscape architect's perspective, viewpoint. So I'm going to start this timeline way back in 1890 or 1871, because that's when Tucson incorporated. And that was when water was still delivered via barrels by a horse or mule-drawn cart. And so people were paying 5 cents a bucket, you know, as they were getting their water. And then it was still a private enterprise, a private franchise. And in 1882 was the first piped water. The city of Tucson had 25 fire hydrants, and we were paying $216 a month to water, you know, for that usage. And the other use that the city was using it for was to sprinkle Main Street. Because of the pipes and having to pipe it from wells, there was a demand management problem in that we didn't have enough pipes, we didn't have enough pumps. So the city was already concerned with demand management on how to get all that water to the people whose pipes that it was getting to. So they were already starting to limit the irrigation at nighttime, and the water supply to parks was shut off. In 1900, Tucson bought the water company, so now it becomes a public utility. And I'm putting down 1904, the state of Arizona, and its proclamation for Arbor Day, because this is really important for the city of Tucson. The ethic back then was to convert a desert city into a garden city. So the city civic leaders were watering the landscape, and they were watering trees. And the Arbor Day proclamation was to give a holiday to the students so that they would go out and plant trees. So between 1907 and 1908, the city of Tucson actually planted 10,000 trees, which is sort of amazing in a year to do that, because in 2014, the mayor of Tucson had a campaign to plant 10,000 trees in 4 years. So we went a little backwards, but we're still planting trees. 1930, we now have a metered service. Prior to that, the pipes were not metered. And again, the landscape ethic was to make this desert city a garden city. So again, I'm just reminding you that a lot of this irrigated water was going to the landscape. Okay, 1940 to the 50s, right? That's when our population tripled. It's post-World War II, and this Mountain Air Force Base is coming in line. And the landscape that is going into the homes are a lot of green, a lot of shrubs, a lot of water use. We still are in that ethic of making this a garden city. The designers are coming from California, and we don't really have any nurseries that are giving us any drought tolerant, low water use or native plants yet. And at this point, the city of Tucson realizes that we're pumping groundwater and the population is increasing so fast and we're pumping so much water, we're already realizing that this is a non-renewable resource now. So we're thinking about it. Okay, so here in 1966, the University of Arizona started their landscape architecture program. This was pretty advanced for here in the city of Tucson or in the southern region, because the two landscape architects who started this program were very forward thinking, and they were already thinking about low water use plants. That was Guy Green and Warren Jones. Warren Jones was already consulting in the Middle East, so he was already thinking about all these low water use plants. Both of them were also doing a lot of collaborations with Ag Extension, with the Horticulture Department, with the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum. So Sunset Magazine commissioned Guy Green to do a demonstration garden at the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum. If you go there, you'll see that demonstration garden is still there. And what the plan was to take the plants that the Desert Museum was highlighting and put it into this demonstration garden so that when homeowners or visitors came, they could see how these plants could be used in the landscape. Also at this time, Mary Rose Duffield, a student of Warren Jones, for her project, published the Plants for Dry Climates that had over 300 plants in it, all low water use, drought tolerant, maybe not quite native, but they were, again, low water use. And this almost became like a Bible to us students who are coming out of this program, because this was the only book that we had that were identifying these plants. So we know about design, we know about the importance of these plants. And next, 1967, the Mountain States Nursery. Ron Gass was one of the first nursery cultivators here in the state of Arizona planting these low water use plants. Ron and Warren Jones were friends, and they would trek down to southern Mexico, to the southern Sonoran Desert, and they were picking up plants and seeds to cultivate and grow so that we designers had plants that we could spec out and plant in the landscapes here in this region. All right, so we're moving along. So here we are, Tucson Water is thinking about pumping all this water out of the ground and realizing that this is a non-renewable, non-sustainable water source. So Tucson Water is already thinking, we're going to have another resource in order to make this a sustainable city. Other cities that were having problems, desert cities, were also thinking about it. Denver coined the term xeriscape, and this caught on like wildflower everywhere. In Southern California, in Arizona, and we're all starting to use the principles of xeriscape and low water use, that you can still have a lush landscape with all of these low water use plants. The Southern Arizona Water Resources Association, SAWARA, 1982, they formed themselves because this group was actually formed to help inform the public about the Central Arizona Project, and that this was going to be a necessary water resource for us here in Southern Arizona. What they were also doing, besides letting the public know about the CAP project, was they started to create a plant list with the water use that could be used, and they were already beginning to promote conservation. This plant list becomes the precursor to ADWR's plant list. Pima County had a landscape architect in the planning department, and he put together the ordinance and the landscape design manual. But what was also happening at this time, with a lot of homes being built and constructed, the designers and the people who loved the desert were saying that we were losing the sense of place for the desert. So a lot of these ordinances had to do with trying to help preserve the native landscape and bringing it back, or salvaging and saving all of these important plants. The city of Tucson followed, so we adopted the xeriscape and landscape screening ordinance, and Tucson Water was getting into their conservation mode with the water waste ordinance. 1974 was probably the hottest and the driest time in the city of Tucson, or this region down here. The city council prior to this had been trying to do tiered watering fee structure in order to incentivize conservation, and they had failed. So in 1976, they appointed a Citizens Water Advisory Committee to help push up the idea of tiered water rates and also help construct that water rates. And the following year, in 1977, tiered rates were passed, and we've been on tiered rates since then. This was also our introduction to Pete the Beak. Pete the Beak was and is still one of the most successful countrywide conservation campaign. And so for 20 years, from 1977 to almost 1997, every year he would come on in the summer, you know, for people and to educate them about water conservation, and that's still going on. The Citizens Water Advisory Committee did its first Desert Landscape Awards, and that then switched over to ADWR, taking it over as the Xeriscape Awards. And then when they all downsized, all of that went away. But anyway, our landscapes are now starting to change. We're using the Xeriscape principles, and from the lush garden mentality, we're slowly switching to the desert city mentality. Okay, so right, 1980, the heavy hitting elephant in the state, ADWR was formed, the State Groundwater Act was formed, the 5 active management areas came about, and we all have to now have these water 100-year management plans. And then in those plans were conservation ethics, and part of it was each of these AMAs has their own low water use, drought tolerant plant list. And the basic thought behind the plant list was in any public right-of-ways that was using potable water, you could only use plants from this list, that you could not use plants that were high water intensive usage. The cities and the municipalities thought, wow, this is a really great list. So they started adopting it so that commercial developers and other like HOAs, they started adopting it and using it because, again, that city garden ethic is now changing to that city desert ethic. And we're all wanting to conserve water, and we're all wanting to look at the desert as a sense of place. So here we are, 1985. The city of Tucson has now added another water source, the reclaimed or the recycled water source. So other than groundwater, we are now using this. And this water was mandated to be used on all large and new golf courses. We were starting to switch playing fields like the cities, parks, as well as school football fields. We were extending our purple pipes out that way and using reclaimed water. So there's a second water source we now have. Okay, so then 1993, TARP is finally completed. The city of Tucson has their recharge and store facilities in Anna Valley. We're starting to store the water. We're only pumping and using the cap water. So now what's happening somewhere around 2010, we're not pumping groundwater anymore. Our groundwater aquifer level is starting to increase and going up. and we're only using the cap water. But I have this picture of the cap coming down through the desert. And what we're saying here in Tucson is that we've been doing this for over 4,000 years because, right, the Hohokams had their acequias and they were pumping water from the rivers to wherever they needed it. So we've been doing that for a long, long time. All right, so we're coming closer to the 2000, and now our growers are catching up with us. The nurseries are forming. Desert Survivor, Nighthawk, Savano Nursery is one of the biggest nurseries here now in southern Arizona, and it's also becoming regional. Greg Starr, as well as Spadefoot Nursery. Pima County Native Plant Nursery also came about because they were still finding in Pima County that not enough native plants were being grown by the commercial growers. So they started growing their own plants that they could put in their public parks and public rights of ways. And so that nursery was started. I have here also, and I'm giving credit to the Savano development that happened way out on the east side of Tucson. And I'm highlighting them because when the city of Tucson was pushing out their purple pipes, and we were doing that with no cost to whoever wanted it, Savano was one of those developments who took that offer, and the purple pipes went all the way out to the east side, and the public areas in Savano are all watered with this reclaimed or recycled water. And then that was also when the Savano Nursery started, because Les Shipley and his crew were doing all the salvaging and the planting of the native trees and cacti into the neighborhoods. That was a good thing. So now we have the mentality to design for a desert city, and we have growers growing plants that we need. And back in 1966, Tucson Water has the Zanjero program. So these are folks who go out to do audits on families or on households and commercial buildings that are using too much water. So we have that ethic again of conservation and conserving water. In 91, the Ag Extension started the Desert Hort conferences, and this was aimed at educating the maintenance people, landscape contractors, designers, and also some homeowners, but it wasn't geared primarily back then to homeowners. It was mostly to people doing design and installation of landscapes. And then in 2002, the desert or the University of Arizona's Arboretum was established. And this is one of the largest, I want to say, testing ground, because Warren Jones planted over 400 trees that he brought back from the Middle East and from southern Mexico into the university campus. And they're still there. They're still being tested and watched. And so this is a great place where people can come and look at those vegetation. They can even take tours. There's docents who do that. In 2006, Dr. Riley started his rainwater harvesting class. So we're all ramping up on all of this. In 2016, the College of Architecture, Planning, and Landscape Architecture started their sustainable built environment. So we're again gearing up, realizing that ecology and the environmental aesthetics that we live in a desert is, well, it's continually changing and bettering itself all the time. Then in 2020, a couple of years ago, Tucson Water started their One Water Master Plan. And this master plan is all about how are we going to utilize the water resources that we have. And we're even thinking, are there other water resources that we haven't tapped into that we should be tapping into? I will say it was maybe about 8 years ago that we started considering rainwater harvesting and stormwater as a water resource. The difficulty with that water resource is it's not metered, so we can't give it a quantity, a measured quantity. We are at best making guesses. So this is sort of that convergence of a lot of things that happened. The reason why I did the timeline for the GSI was to make that awareness that everything doesn't happen in a vacuum, that we're all building upon past and on each other. So it's each of us working to make things better. It's us as professionals or as consumers, nonprofits, and the educational institutions that are also working together and building upon each other. And then of course, there's government and the regulatory tools and education that we do in that also. So again, it's a convergence of multi things. So that's about it. Here's some information for those people here in Southern Arizona. You know, Tucson Water is embarking on this One Water. If you go to that site, you can get more information. We're going to have a survey out pretty soon. Our most recent publication, The Responsible Desert Dwelling, has to do with our water ethic. Some of the stuff I covered in this talk is also in this information also. And in closing, I think all of us here, we're here because we want to influence change in our community.
The primary goals of PDEQ are to protect human health in the environment. In particular, we want to be improving water quality and also to protect our air and soil. The Flood Control District is also working towards providing a service to the public in terms of minimizing flood control and erosion damage, both to people, their properties, and our infrastructure. There's also a broad set of activities that the county is engaged in on the hazard mitigation that are addressing the 3 areas, which has to do with extreme heat, flooding, and drought. With all of these services to be provided, there are a whole host of activities that we can be engaged in. And our goal is to be using the most cost-effective approach that brings us the biggest bang for our investment. So I've put together a slide here that is a summary of events that are supporting our activities on green infrastructure. And thank you, Irene, for starting in the 1800s. I wanted to start with the state, with Arizona becoming a territory in 1863 and then a state in 1912. And of course, you're all aware of the Harbors and Rivers Act in 1899, which was the first federal regulation that was controlling pollutants in the junk that was being dropped into our navigable waters. We really didn't have a whole lot of activity until 1948. When there was the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. And so it was about this time, I want to blend in with the regulations that were driving this. Also, what the general perspective was, what this paradigm was for how people were managing stormwater. So in the 1890s, we were looking at just stick it in a pipe and get rid of it. And by the 1950s, we were recognizing that pipes that were out there were also used to be transporting sewage. And so the 2 of those together was causing problems. So they said, okay, let's separate them. And now if we're going to transport it, let's do it through stormwater pipes. a lot of things then started to change then in the 1970s. As we were really trying to make sure that, well, the Clean Water Act was put out in 1972, so there was a consciousness of the water quality issues that were coming forward, that were existing, and a lot of activities were taking place to issue permits and have a lot of these organizations collect water quality data from the streams and lakes and our coastal regions. And by 1990, EPA was clear that the Clean Water Act was not strong enough to accomplish this, and came up with the Pollution Prevention Act, which was geared to take care of the sources of pollution, not just at the point sources, but also at the non-point sources. By 1990, many of the wastewater treatment plants that had been discharging into the rivers had permits and were effectively controlling their pollutants, but there wasn't very much in terms of an improvement to the water quality. And so they started looking at the non-point sources. And that's where the idea of the green infrastructure, people weren't really quite sure where the pollution was coming from, but they were trying to figure out where it is. And so the gray infrastructure that people were building, they were clear this isn't quite as good as what we thought. They started to build detention basins then that would help to reduce the amount of floods that would come through the system. But that still wasn't very effective because it wasn't looking at the systems in a systematic way. And so I wanted to tie this to our weather that is happening. As Irene was noting, in the summer of 1977, we had a drought. But by October of that year, there was massive rainfalls in southern Arizona and massive rainfalls in March of the next year along the Mogollon Rim, which caused a lot of flooding in the Green River and the Salt and the Gila. Raul Castro passed an executive order in 1977 saying we are going to be following what the Pima's requirements are for hazard mitigation and also for floodplain insurance. And it still took some time for Pima County to develop. It took about a year to develop our flood control district in 1988. Additionally, in the 1986, the Environmental Quality Act was written, which was mostly written for air quality and for the, for groundwater quality, but surface water was also becoming an issue. And PDEQ was created in 1990, shortly thereafter. So I think through the 1990s, there was now a way of looking at managing stormwater so that there was a more focused approach to how to make water quality improvements. A lot of people still didn't think there wasn't really an issue with water quality. So it didn't really start to change until we had the late 1990s when the Green Revolution started. And there was an effort by EPA based on water quality studies that have been conducted to allow low impact development as a control measure inside of an NPDES or an AZICTES permit. As a matter of fact, by 2011, Pima County got their second permit for municipal separate storm sewer system permit. And it was the first time we were required to look at could LID be used? And of course, we looked at it and said 100% that would be very useful to us. Now, it would be useful to PDEQ for meeting permit requirements. But the thing that was really interesting was that for flood control, it was very important for erosion and flood management as well. So we started to put together a whole series of tools that would enable people to be building their own LID systems. And we recognize that it would be useful at neighborhood scale to large scale. And so a series of documents were put together there that are listed in that lower central part. And so I think that there's been a lot of efforts towards building LID. One of the things that has been most useful is that we've had a theoretical understanding about how, I shouldn't say theoretical, we've had a lot of studies that have looked at a particular site saying, if you use this kind of a control measure, if you're using biofiltration or if you're using detention basin, we know that there's water quality improvement that's taking place, but it wasn't really being quantified. The Water Research Foundation started to collect that data in 1988 when they created the stormwater database. And so they have a number of people around the world. So this isn't just here in the United States, it's in Europe as well, where people are looking at what the influence is to an LID feature and what the water quality is that's coming out, so they can identify if you have this kind of water quality coming in, what is it removing? And so you can get a sense about the effectiveness of a particular LID feature. That information now is informing how we are developing this last item here. Our permit requires that we put in retrofit features, and we have 3 retrofit areas that we're looking at. And in our assessment, that's been one of the items that we submitted to ADEQ for when we submitted our three items, was we think this is going to work because we've seen documentation that detention basins are effective at removing E. coli and copper. So there, and so is the vegetation that is installed in a lot of these LID features.
All right, my name is Jesse Wested. I'm a landscape architect with Workgroup Design, and we were part of the team for the Lake Havasu City LID master plan. So we're going to be speaking about that for the next 15-20 minutes. So we also did the project with Helm, which is a civil engineering group. So how it all kind of came to be was going all the way back to this FEMA Cooperating Technical Partners Program, so CTP. And this was formed all the way back in December 2003 between Mojave Flood Control District and FEMA. And then that moved into preparing the Mojave County Low Impact Development Guide for flood protection and water sustainability. And that was performed by Helm and Kieran Sikdar, when he was with them, who you might know from Watershed Management Group, and now he's with West Consultants. So a lot of these pieces in this manual kind of came back from, lessons learned from when we were working projects with WMG, City of Tucson, all of that. And then in order for the LID master plan to move forward, was Lake Havasu City partnered with the county to obtain CTP grant funding, do the same process. And then that was through the FEMA risk map project. So kind of the purpose and the goals of the LID master plan was providing resilient community development, engaging developers, engineers, designers, city staff, both sides on the public side internally, and then also on as consultants. And then what they wanted was to create, city specific LED guidance and design principles, recommendations for LED alternatives, next step guidance to build upon, and then also just helping achieve a broadening of the city sustainability culture where, and I think, we've all been through this as we're trying to move these items forward, is just, keep preaching the gospel, getting everybody on board, getting more pilot projects in the ground, and, from lessons learned, kind of keep moving things forward. So existing GSI LED measures that are currently happening with Lake Havasu City. So this aquatic center, it's kind of as you're coming into town on the highway. So Watershed Management Group worked on this project, and they did different kind of like with these curb cuts and bioswales, both in the parking lot around it. And then there's also a piece on the streetscape that they did as well. Another really interesting piece in Lake Havasu City is their Rotary Community Park. And if you ever visit this park area, they've got stabilized DG path. It's just shredded wood chip mulch everywhere. And you've got a lot of volunteers of vegetation kind of growing. And this is the first place where I really saw, different kinds of wildlife, road runners. It really seemed like a place that was alive. And it felt 10 degrees cooler than everywhere else in the city because you didn't have the rock and everything else that's normally associated with Lake Havasu City. At their street maintenance facility, they have these 2 large 5,000 gallon cisterns that collect rainwater off their roof. And then it also collects the AC condensate as well. And then this project here is the Foothills Bank. And it's not so much vegetation, but where they did the curb cuts, where they're having kind of ponding issues with the stormwater, and then just having it kind of going out into the landscape. And when I went around the city to look at all these projects, it was with Brianna Morgan, who was their water conservation specialist at the time when we started the project. And then also Drew Means, who's with their maintenance group. So I wanted them to show me around and kind of see like what had been done the last 10 years and how they could build upon this. So some of the issues that's with Lake Havasu City is the fact that you only get about a little over 4 inches of rainfall. But another big piece of this is that their streetscapes, where a lot of times it's on a pretty hefty slope, where when it rains, it takes all that sediment that's in everybody's kind of private yards and just shoots that into the street and then shoots it down the road until it eventually stops. So Drew said that basically one of the biggest issues is, they don't get a lot of rainstorms, but when they do, then they're out there with maintenance vehicles and then having to scoop all this sediment up, get it back in the trucks, get it out. And then if you have a situation where it's back-to-back storms, then you basically just start this whole process all over again. Because right now there's not a lot of infrastructure where you've got street trees and things can kind of slow the sedimentation down. So what we wanted to do was kind of take all the lessons learned that we've been looking at over the last kind of decade, both with projects that we had helped out with Watershed Management Group, and then also projects when on the professional side when I was at Kimley Horn and then starting Work Urban Design. So with streetscape projects, sediment traps, how these things all work together. And another piece too is, again, not starting from the beginning, look at what the details that we've been using and build upon them and just have them more specific to Lake Havasu City. So we also wanted to look at, okay, how do we do things for, let's say that single residential house? What can they do on their own yard? Because the majority of the city is, single family residential houses. So how can you give them these tools where they can help the infrastructure in the city? So knowing that, let's say 4.3 inches of annual rainfall, and let's say you only capture on one side of the house, you got 1,000 square foot roof, you know, you're running about 2,594 gallons of water that you can use. AC condensate, let's say if it's just a 2-ton unit, we're picking up 571. And again, so this is out of 2 adults. So laundry machine is on average volume per load, average loads per person a week, 2.2. So that we're picking up 3,931 gallons per year. And then showers, again, with 2 people, we're running 8,390 gallons. So understanding, yeah, it doesn't always rain, but how can you keep this water coming into the landscape and providing enough stuff for your vegetation to survive? So if we had an example house, this may or may not be my house, but on this example house, we're collecting rainwater in a cistern from the roof. We've got gray water collection from the showers here. And then we also have laundry machine gray water coming out of this pipe here. So that's supplying the basins. Here, this was the whole process going through this was doing, you know, irrigation that's drip line from the showers, just running wood chip mulch over the top of it, helping build that soil, and then running crappie over the top of that. And now you kind of have a ground cover that could help slow the sedimentation down going into the streets without using any potable water. So again, identifying BMPs that would work best with the city. So bioswales with check dams, curb openings, curb extensions, permeable pavements, bioretention, harvesting tanks, and stormwater harvesting basins. And looking at the different pieces that could be within these neighborhoods. And then having this where a neighborhood group could be like, okay, well, what do we have? Do we have attached sidewalk? Do we have a rolled curb, detached sidewalk, or no curb? And then you would pick which one applies to your neighborhood and then create the associated, you know, bioswales, curb cuts, bump outs, etc. Again, because it's so hot there, you know, how could you make it where it's more user-friendly if you're going to be on a bike? So trying to keep detached sidewalks and bringing the bike out of the traffic, but then also you need large amounts of shade. So what that would look like. And what the city was looking for was kind of like these pilot projects. So we picked 3 sites that the city could use for pilot projects. And their main downtown is this McCulloch Boulevard, this stretch here. And that's where, you know, when they have their events, people go down there and hang out. They also go down there for, you got the little car group and they're there every week. So the big thing is, you know, they don't want to have parking taken away because that's, you know, what they look forward to every week. So making sure that we are getting engagement with the stakeholders and how can we make these pieces a little bit better for you to enjoy your time there. So again, looking at from projects that we've done in the past, where these same things could be associated with on McCulloch. And then, you know, being able to show the different user groups, you know, how can we can provide more shade, provide a cooler environment, you know, reduce the length of being able to walk across streets. And then also where we have limited space, introducing things such as silva cells or suspended pavement. So now you actually have a root zone for the trees to become fully grown, because in order for a tree to become fully grown, it needs about 500,000 cubic feet of soil. So if it's typically in a 5x5 planter, that's 25 square feet. So that's only 75 cubic feet of soil that it has to grow in. So it's going to start growing at 4 to 7 years, and then it's going to start declining. So how can we actually build investment and spend the money on the whole for the tree instead of just the tree that's going to die in 4 to 7 years? And then like push these systems together where you can have a permeable pavement, take the stormwater off the street, put it into the silva cells, and then have the rooting space. Another piece that's on that McCulloch Boulevard is the Catalyst site. And the city got a grant for this site. And what they want to do is provide a mixed use development that's here along the streetscape. And then also a park area where you can have an amphitheater and have events. and then have a bridge that connects the parking. So again, this project's going to move forward. So how can we just get ahead with this document and provide examples on how they could do the right thing here? So again, just looking at the different pieces, looking at, hey, how we can provide street trees and provide areas for the water to infiltrate. And then since it's mixed use, now we're going to have gray water and AC condensate. So again, now we've got year-round a water source, so we can get more vegetation rolling through there. And then this will create this entryway into the amphitheater and truly become like what it's supposed to be, right? When they're saying they want this catalyst site, well, this is going to become a catalyst on how to, develop things here within the desert on a limited supply of water. The third space that we looked at was they're having issues with water infiltration on their island ball fields. So they had a golf course that was taking a bunch of the effluent, and when that golf course went away, now they just have excess ponding. So we looked at, what could be done in this situation. So we partnered with Parjana and how that can help move the water through the soil and get it off the surface field. So Parjana is almost these long kind of plastic, it's almost like a capillary action that takes the water and just kind of helps push the water down into the soil. And that's it.